there! You are on the Follow Sleep with Margot channel. Today, we are talking about the Mandela Effect. This is not mysticism, not conspiracy theory, not an attempt to frighten you or make you doubt reality. It is an attempt to understand, calmly, methodically, with evidence, why millions of people around the world share the same memories of events that never happened. We will examine the phenomenon from different angles: the neurobiology of memory, social psychology, the statistics of mass delusions, quantum physics and interpretations of reality, and perhaps the latest hypotheses from theoretical physics that try to explain the inexplicable. Get comfortable. Our goal is not to wake you up, but to gently guide you into sleep through understanding. Through facts, through logic. We begin. Part 1. What is the Mandela Effect? First, a definition. The term Mandela Effect emerged in 2009. Its author is Fiona Broome, an American researcher of paranormal phenomena, blogger, and writer. At a conference, she discovered that many people around her shared a memory that doesn't exist in official history. They were certain that Nelson Mandela, the South African politician and anti-apartheid activist, died in prison in the 1980s. They remembered TV reports. They remembered mourning ceremonies. They remembered speeches by his widow. In reality, Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990, became president of South Africa, and died only in 2013, at the age of 95. The gap between collective memory and documented facts was so striking that Broome gave this phenomenon a name: the Mandela Effect. Since then, the list of examples has only grown. Let's examine the most famous cases, those that are documented, researched, and unquestionable as phenomena of mass perception. Let's turn to our first example, the Berenstein or Berenstein Bears. In the 1980s and 1990s, a series of children's books called The Berenstein Bears was extremely popular in the US. The books were published in huge print runs, cartoons were made from them, toys were produced. The problem is that millions of people, by some estimates, tens of millions, are firmly convinced that the bear's surname is spelled Berenstein, with an E and I. In their memory, the books were called exactly that. They remember this from childhood. They are ready to argue about it. But the facts say otherwise. All editions, originals, reprints, official websites, interviews with the authors use the spelling Berenstein. The authors really were named Stan and Jan Berenstein. That is their real surname. It is written on all documents. Why did tens of millions of people remember it differently? Second example, The Mirror in Chocolat. The 2000 film Chocolat, with Juliette Binoche and Johnny Depp. There is a scene that many viewers remember with crystal clarity. William the Conqueror looks into a mirror, and his reflection doesn't repeat his movements. It lives its own life, smiles, winks. This scene is not in the film. At all. Not in any version. Not in the director's cut, not in the extended version, not in any alternative edits. Johnny Depp has repeatedly confirmed in interviews that such a scene was never filmed. But people remember it. They remember details. They remember how they felt while watching it. They remember who they watched the film with. Third example, Luke, I Am Your Father. This is perhaps the most famous example in popular culture. The phrase, Luke, I Am Your Father, has become a meme, a quote, part of the collective unconscious. Darth Vader never said those words. In the 1980 film The Empire Strikes Back, the dialogue is different. Luke, he killed my father. Vader, no, I am your father. That's it. No. Luke, no address by name. Pure negation, followed by admission. But generations of viewers stubbornly remember that very phrase. It has entered film history textbooks, parodies, everyday speech, although it never existed. Fourth example, Monopoly and the Monocle. Remember the little man from the Monopoly game logo, Mr. Monopoly? Does he have a monocle? Many are sure that he does. A round pince-nez in his eye, like a rich gentleman. In reality, he never had a monocle. He has a top hat, he has a mustache, he has a tailcoat, but no monocle. Check right now, open any game box, any official logo, no monocle. Yet this image is so ingrained in mass consciousness that in 2017, Hasbro conducted a special survey. It turned out that most people remember the monocle so vividly that they are ready to argue about it. Fifth example, Ford and the assassin. In November 1963, President John Kennedy was assassinated. Millions of people remember footage of Lee Harvey Oswald being shot right in the police station. They remember what it looked like. They remember details. In reality, Oswald's murder occurred in the basement of the police headquarters, but television cameras did not capture the moment of the shooting itself. The footage shown on television was filmed afterward: the body on the floor, the commotion, the arrest of Jack Ruby. But many people's memories recorded a live broadcast of the murder. This case is interesting because we can trace the mechanism of forming false collective memory here. Repeated replays of photographs, eyewitness accounts, reconstructions and documentaries, all of this created a memory that people couldn't have had. Fixed example: geography and anatomy. New Zealand. Where is it on the map? Most people are sure it's northeast of Australia. In reality, it's southeast. The error is so widespread that cartographers have given it a special name: the Bold New Zealand shift. Human anatomy. Where are the kidneys located? Most people point to the lower back, closer to the spine. In reality, the kidneys are higher, partially protected by the ribs, closer to the center of the body. The error is related to the fact that kidney pain often radiates to the lower back, and the brain moves the organ to where the pain is felt. Interim conclusion: all these examples share one thing: they are massive. These are not isolated errors of individual people. They are stable, reproducible phenomena affecting millions of carriers of culture. The question: why? Part 2. The neurobiology of memory: how the brain deceives itself. To understand the Mandela Effect, we must start with the fundamentals, with how human memory actually works. For a long time, it was believed that memory was like a video recording. The brain records events, stores them in an archive, and then, when needed, plays them back. This metaphor is understandable, convenient, and completely wrong. Modern neuroscience says something different. Memory is a construction. Every time you remember something, the brain doesn't play back a recording. It assembles the event anew from scattered fragments. How memory works: a brief overview. There is no single center in the brain where memories are stored. They are distributed. The visual cortex stores images, the auditory cortex stores sounds, the prefrontal cortex stores context and sequence, the motor cortex stores movements. When you remember something, the brain simultaneously activates all these areas and assembles them into a coherent picture. This process is called memory consolidation and reconsolidation. When a memory first forms, it goes through a consolidation stage. Neural connections are strengthened, information is fixed. But when you later access that memory, it becomes plastic again. You retrieve it, and at that moment, it is vulnerable to changes. Then it is stored again, reconsolidated. And each time during this process, changes can be introduced. In other words, every time you remember something, you slightly change that memory. This has been experimentally confirmed by numerous studies. For example, in the 1970s, psychologist Elizabeth Loftus conducted a series of famous experiments that revolutionized our understanding of memory. The Loftus experiments: how to implant false memories. Loftus showed subjects videos of car accidents. After viewing, she asked questions with different wording. How fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Or, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? The difference in verbs, smashed versus hit. influenced speed estimates. Those who heard the word smashed reported higher speeds. But the most interesting part came later. A week later, subjects were asked, "Did you see any broken glass at the accident scene?" There was no broken glass in any of the videos, but those who had been asked the question with smashed were more likely to remember broken glass. Loftus had not merely distorted an estimate, she had implanted an entire element into people's memory that never existed. In later experiments, she went even further. Subjects were told stories from their childhood, supposedly from relatives. Among the real stories was one fabricated one, for example, about getting lost in a shopping mall at age 5 and being found by an elderly person. About 25% of subjects remembered this event in detail, although it never happened. The mechanism of confabulation. In neuroscience, this is called confabulation, filling gaps in memory with plausible but false details. The brain hates emptiness. If a fragment is missing from a memory, it constructs it, based on expectations, stereotypes, other information. In the case of Mr. Monopoly, the brain constructs a monocle because a rich gentleman from the early 20th century, in our cultural code, is associated with a monocle. Pince-nez, top hat, mustache, these form a composite image. The brain sees the missing detail and adds it. In the case of Luke, I am your father, a different mechanism works: dialogue compression and reconstruction. The film has a scene where Vader says, "No, I am your father." In popular culture, the phrase circulates as, "Luke, I am your father," because it sounds more natural, more dramatic, easier to remember. People remember the essence, not the exact words, and later, when they need to recall, the brain reconstructs the dialogue based on the essence, not the fact. The role of emotion in memory formation. Emotionally charged events are remembered better, but they are also distorted more strongly. Adrenaline and cortisol, released during stress, enhance memory consolidation but simultaneously make it more vulnerable to distortion during subsequent retrievals. The death of a public figure is an emotional event. Therefore, memories of Nelson Mandela's death, false or real, became so firmly established. The brain recorded the emotion, and the details were constructed later. Conclusion from neurobiology. From a neurobiological perspective, the Mandela effect is explained by the characteristics of memory function. Mass false memories arise when 1. A large number of people share similar expectations and stereotypes. 2. Information is repeatedly presented in distorted form. 3. Emotional background facilitates the fixation of false details. 4. Cultural context suggests to the brain how to construct missing elements. It would seem the matter is settled. But one detail remains that doesn't fit this explanation. The unexplained residue. Why do millions of people remember Mandela's death in the same way? Not just he died, but specific details, TV reports, speeches by his widow, mourning ceremonies. Why do they remember news that never existed? Neurobiology explains how a false memory can arise in one person, but it struggles to explain how the same false memory arises in millions of unconnected people, living in different countries, speaking different languages, never having discussed it among themselves. Here, neurobiology gives way to social psychology. Part 3, Social Psychology. Now we move to the second level of explanation. If neurobiology answers the question, how does an individual's memory work? Then social psychology answers the question, how do these individual memories interact and create shared illusions? Conformity in the Asch experiments. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted a series of experiments that became classics. Subjects were shown 2 cards, one with a line, the other with 3 lines of different lengths. They had to say which of the 3 lines matched the length of the line on the first card. The task was extremely simple. Error rate when alone was less than 1%. But in the experiment, there were Confederate actors. They began giving deliberately incorrect answers. About 30% of real subjects agreed with the majority at least once, even seeing that the answer was wrong. and 75% yielded to pressure at least once. Conclusion: people are willing to change their perception of reality under group pressure, even when it comes to something simple and objective, like the length of a line. Informational influence and social proof. In real life, we rarely deal with such simple stimuli as lines on cards. Usually, information is complex, contradictory, incomplete. In these conditions, we rely on others as sources of information. If many people say the bear's surname is Berenstein, then it must be so. They can't all be wrong. This works even without direct pressure, simply through observing others' opinions. This is called informational social influence. In the internet age, this influence is amplified many times over. It's enough for one person to write in a blog, "I remember Mandela died in prison," and hundreds of others chime in, "I remember too, me too." An illusion of massiveness emerges. The more people confirm a false memory, the more real it seems. The false consensus effect. People tend to overestimate the degree to which others share their opinions and memories. If I remember something, it seems natural to me that others should remember it the same way. When I find confirmation online, it strengthens my confidence, even if the confirmation comes from similarly mistaken people. Cultural scripts and stereotypes. Many false memories are structured by culture. We know how the death of a public figure should look. News, mourning, speeches by the widow. We know how a rich gentleman from the past should be. Look, top hat, mustache, monocle. When something is missing in reality, the brain constructs the missing elements from the cultural script. And it constructs them identically in many people, because cultural scripts are shared. Memory schema theory. Psychologist Frederick Bartlett proposed the theory of memory schemas back in the 1930s. According to this theory, memories are organized around schemas, generalized representations of how the world works. When we recall an event, we don't reproduce it exactly. We reconstruct it according to our schemas. If the schema for death of a leader includes TV reports, the brain will add TV reports to the memory, even if there were none. Asterism information effect. In 1974, Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer conducted another important experiment. Subjects watched a video of an accident and were then asked questions containing false information. After some time, many remembered what they had been asked about as something they had actually seen. In real life, the misinformation effect operates constantly. News, rumors, discussions, social media posts, all of this can implant false details into memory. The Nelson Mandela case, a reconstruction. Why did mass false memory about Mandela's death in the 1980s arise? Researchers propose this reconstruction. 1. Nelson Mandela was indeed in prison. That is a fact. 2. In the 1980s, a wave of campaigns for his release swept the world. Concerts, rallies, news. 3. Around the same time, Steve Biko died, another South African activist, also an anti-apartheid fighter. He died in prison in 1977. 4. In 1989, Joe Slovo, leader of the South African Communist Party, died in prison. 5. Information about the deaths of other activists could have become mixed with information about Mandela, especially for people not closely following South African politics. 6. In 1990, Mandela was released from prison. For many, this came as a surprise. They thought he was already dead. 7. This surprise became fixed in memory as I remember that he died. 8. Then the mechanism of social confirmation kicked in. People found each other, discussed it, reinforced the false memory. Why are other examples so persistent? In the case of Berenstein, there's an added factor of pronunciation. The surname Berenstein is pronounced with a long A, which is unusual in English. It sounds more familiar because many surnames end in Stein. Einstein, Goldstein. The brain corrects the awkward pronunciation to a familiar one, and then the spelling follows. In the case of Luke, I am your father. Multiple cultural citations are at work. The phrase in its distorted form was repeated so often that the original was displaced. Individual memory characteristics, tendency to confabulate, schema operation, social influence, conformity, informational influence, cultural stereotypes, shared ideas about how things should be, media influence, repetition of distorted information. In this model, no mysticism is required. The Mandela Effect is simply another manifestation of how human consciousness operates in a social context. But the story doesn't end here. Because there is a third level of explanation, the level of physics and the philosophy of reality. Part 4. The Philosophy of Reality. What is a fact? Before moving to the boldest hypotheses, we must ask a fundamental question. What, after all, should be considered a fact? What is real? Past. This may sound like idle philosophizing, but it is actually a key question for understanding the Mandela Effect. The problem of the past's existence. Philosophers have long noticed a strange thing. We have no direct access to the past. We only have our memories, other people's testimonies, material artifacts, photographs, documents, video recordings, interpretations of these artifacts. None of these are the past itself. They are merely traces that we interpret. Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, formulated the problem radically. The world could have been created 5 minutes ago, complete with our memories and all the evidence of earlier existence. We have no way to disprove this. This is called the 5-minute hypothesis. It is unprovable and unfalsifiable. Of course, most of us consider it a pointless mental exercise. But it illustrates an important principle. Our knowledge of the past is always mediated. The problem of evidence. What do we consider reliable evidence? A photograph? But photographs can be forged. A video recording? It can be edited. A document? It could be a fake. The agreement of millions of people? They could be mistaken. In court, juries face this problem every day. Witnesses make mistakes. Documents are forged. Video can be distorted. Truth often remains unattainable. In the case of the Mandela Effect, we have a conflict between two types of evidence: mass memory and physical artifacts. Usually we trust artifacts. But the question is this always justified? The problem of interpretation. Physical artifacts also need to be interpreted. The book The Berenstein Bears exists. On the cover it says Berenstein. That is a fact. But what if it previously said Berenstein and then changed? This sounds like madness. But to disprove this hypothesis, we would need access to the past state of the book, which we don't have. We only have its current state and our memory of what it should be. Solipsism and collective solipsism. In its extreme form, one could argue that reality is subjective. Each of us lives in our own world. The coincidence of our worlds is an illusion generated by the similarity of our brain structures. But most people reject this position because it renders any discussion of reality meaningless. Scientific realism. The standard scientific position: there exists an objective reality, independent of our consciousness. We can study it, gain knowledge about it, test it experimentally. Discrepancies between our representations and reality are errors of cognition that can be corrected. In this paradigm, the Mandela Effect is simply an error, massive, but an error. The problem of scientific realism. But scientific realism also has its difficulties. Quantum physics, which we'll discuss in the next part, calls into question the very concept of objective reality. It turns out that at the fundamental level, what we call reality depends on the process of observation. The Copenhagen interpretation. In the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, proposed by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, an object does not possess definite properties until the moment of measurement. The measurement itself creates reality. If we transfer this to the macro level, which, strictly speaking, is incorrect, but many do it, we could imagine that the past is also undetermined until we measure it with our memories and artifacts. Enter in conclusion. Philosophical analysis doesn't provide an answer, but it expands the space of possibilities. It shows that our confidence in the stability of the past is based on tacit assumptions that could be mistaken. Perhaps the Mandela Effect points to real instability of the past. Or perhaps it merely shows the limitations of our cognitive abilities. Part 5. Quantum Physics. The Many Worlds Interpretation. And Reality. Now we approach the most complex and most controversial part of our discussion: quantum physics, and its possible connections to the Mandela Effect. Let me be clear from the start. No serious physicist claims that quantum mechanics explains mass false memories. That would be a huge stretch. But some interpretations of quantum theory create a metaphorical or even literal context in which the phenomenon of a changing past acquires meaning. Basics of quantum mechanics for non-specialists. Let's start with basic principles. In classical physics, the world is definite. A particle has a position and a velocity. We can measure them. They exist independently of measurement. In quantum physics, everything is different. Before measurement, a particle does not have a definite position. It exists in a superposition, smeared across space, existing in many states simultaneously. Measurement collapses this superposition into one specific state. This process is called the actorisk collapse of the wave function. The problem is that no one knows how or why collapse occurs. This is the central mystery of quantum mechanics. Everett's many worlds interpretation. In 1957, physicist Hugh Everett proposed a radical solution. What if collapse doesn't occur? What if all possibilities are realized, but in different branches of reality? In this interpretation, when a quantum event occurs, the universe splits. In one branch, the particle passed through the left slit, in another, through the right slit. Both branches are equally real. They exist in parallel. We are aware of only one branch because our consciousness also splits along with reality. In each branch, there is a copy of us that considers its branch the only reality. This is called the actorisk many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. How does this relate to the Mandela Effect? Now, let's take a step that physicists themselves usually don't take, but that popularizers often do. Let's extend the many worlds interpretation to macroscopic events and to time. If the universe is constantly branching, the number of parallel realities is colossal. In each of them, history developed slightly differently. In one reality, the bears were called Berenstein. In another, Berenstein. In one, Mandela died in prison. In another, he was released. Usually, these realities do not interact at all. They are parallel and independent. But what if sometimes interference between realities occurs? What if the boundaries between branches become permeable? What if our consciousness is capable of jumping from one branch to another, carrying memories from the previous one? Then the Mandela Effect would be a consequence of such transitions. We remember another reality because we lived in it for some time. String theory and brains. In string theory, our universe could be a three-dimensional brain membrane, floating in multidimensional space. Other universes, other brains, could exist nearby, in parallel dimensions. Sometimes, brains can approach, or even collide. At moments of such interactions, information exchange between universes might be possible, or, if you will, a leakage of memories. The holographic principle. Another interesting idea is the holographic principle. According to it, all information about the three-dimensional world could be encoded on a two-dimensional surface surrounding this world. Reality is a hologram, a projection of information from the universe's boundary. In this model, past, present, and future could exist simultaneously, like information on a hologram. Our perception of time is a way of reading this information sequentially, but the information itself doesn't change. Then the Mandela effect would be a reading error. We read the wrong section of the hologram. Do experimental confirmations of these ideas exist? Direct ones, no. Indirect ones, yes, but they are extremely controversial. In quantum physics, there is the phenomenon of quantum entanglement. Particles can be connected so that a change in one instantly affects the other, regardless of distance. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance. Entanglement has been experimentally confirmed, but transferring this to the macro level, no one has learned to do that yet. The scientific community's opinion. The vast majority of physicists consider the many worlds interpretation speculative, but mathematically permissible. It doesn't contradict known laws, but it also doesn't require mandatory acceptance. Applying it to the Mandela effect is pure speculation, lacking scientific foundation. Why do we talk about this at all? Because the human mind seeks explanations. When traditional ones, neurobiology, psychology, seem insufficient, we turn to the boldest hypotheses. The Mandela effect touches something deep in our perception of reality. It makes us feel that the world is not as stable as it seems. And quantum physics provides a language for this feeling, even if it doesn't provide scientific confirmation. Part 6. Simulation Theory. Are we living in the Matrix? Another popular hypothesis that cannot be ignored when discussing the Mandela effect is the simulation hypothesis. The idea is not new. Philosophers have pondered it for centuries. Descartes suggested that an evil demon might be deceiving our senses. In the 20th century, this idea became known as the brain in a vat. But its modern formulation was given by philosopher Nick Bostrom in 2003. Bostrom's simulation argument. Bostrom proposed 3 possibilities, one of which must be true. 1. Almost all civilizations at our level of development go extinct before reaching technological maturity necessary to create realistic simulations. 2. Almost all civilizations that reach this level lose interest in creating simulations. 3. We are almost certainly living in a simulation. Bostrom's logic: if a civilization reaches a level allowing it to create realistic simulations of consciousness, and if it is interested in doing so, it will create a huge number of such simulations. The number of simulated consciousnesses would vastly exceed the number of original ones. Therefore, any randomly selected consciousness would with overwhelming probability be in a simulation. How the Mandela effect fits into the simulation hypothesis. If we live in a simulation, different scenarios for explaining the Mandela effect are possible. 1. Simulation glitches. Like in a computer program, errors, bugs, and inconsistencies can arise in the simulation. The Mandela effect is glitches noticeable to users, US. 2. Reality updates. The simulation's developers might make changes to the past, optimizing code or fixing errors. Our consciousness retains memory of the old version. 3. Resource economizing. The simulation might not render details until they are observed. Like in computer games, where distant objects exist only in simplified form. When we remember the past, the simulation constructs it on the fly. Identically, they receive identically erroneous constructions. 4. Accessized consciousness testing. Developers might deliberately introduce inconsistencies to study how simulated consciousnesses react to them. The Mandela effect is part of the experiment. Problems with the simulation hypothesis. From a scientific standpoint, the simulation hypothesis is unfalsifiable, but also untestable. Any experiment, any observation, could be part of the simulation. There is no way to prove or disprove that we are in a simulation. Moreover, the hypothesis explains nothing. It merely transfers the problem to another level. If we are in a simulation, who created the simulators? And who created them? Infinite regress. Physicists' opinions. Some physicists, like showman cosmologist Alan Guth, have seriously considered the possibility that our universe could have been created in a laboratory by some advanced civilization. But this remains pure speculation. Most scientists regard the simulation hypothesis as an interesting philosophical exercise, not relevant to scientific practice. Why is this hypothesis popular? It provides a simple and understandable explanation for incomprehensible phenomena. System glitch is intuitively clear to anyone who has used a computer. The Mandela Effect is easily imagined as a glitch in the matrix. Moreover, this hypothesis is supported by popular culture. Films like The Matrix, The 13th Floor, Vanilla Sky, and others. Part 7. Critical Analysis. Why most scientists don't believe in the reality of the Mandela Effect. We have examined several levels of explanation, from neurobiology to quantum physics and simulation theory. Now it's time for the most important part, critical analysis. Why do the overwhelming majority of scientists, neuroscientists, psychologists, physicists, not consider the Mandela Effect evidence of changing reality? Argument 1. Occam's razor. In science, a principle known as Occam's razor applies. Entities should not be multiplied without necessity. If a phenomenon can be explained by simple causes, there is no need to invoke complex ones. The Mandela Effect is perfectly explained by known mechanisms of memory and social psychology. We don't need parallel universes or quantum leaps. What we already know about brain function is sufficient. Argument 2. Lack of predictive power. A scientific theory should not only explain known facts, but also predict new ones. The hypothesis of real past change makes no testable predictions. We cannot say, tomorrow at 3 p.m., the past will change in such and such a way, and we will record it. The false memory hypothesis, by contrast, allows predictions. For example, we can predict that people will make more errors in cases where cultural stereotypes exist. This can be tested experimentally. Argument 3. Non-uniformity of the effect. If the past were really changing, changes should be random or follow some pattern. But we see clear cultural conditioning. People in different countries have different false memories. Corresponding to their cultural context, the British remember one set of non-existent events, Americans another, Russians a third. This is easily explained by different cultural scripts and difficult to explain by changing reality. Argument 4. Evolution of the effect over time. The Mandela Effect has intensified with the development of the internet and social media. This is natural. The more people communicate, the more they infect each other with false memories. If it were about changing reality, the connection to the internet would be far from obvious. Argument 5. Individual differences. Not all people are equally susceptible to the Mandela Effect. There is a correlation with suggestibility, anxiety, memory type. This points to a psychological, not physical nature of the phenomenon. Argument 6. Possibility of experimental verification. Psychologists can create false memories under laboratory conditions. This has been done hundreds of times. The methodology is established. We can implant memories of events that never happened. Therefore, the mechanism is understood and reproducible. Argument 7. The consensus problem. If the past changes, where is the consensus about what it should be? Millions of people remember Berenstein, but billions have never heard of these bears. For them, the surname has always been Berenstein. Whose memory is correct? The hypothesis of changing past cannot answer this question. The scientific community's position. In summary, from the scientific standpoint, the Mandela Effect is an interesting psychological and social phenomenon, but nothing more. It is fully explained by known mechanisms and does not require invoking new physics. All talk of parallel universes, quantum leaps, and simulation is popular mythology, lacking scientific foundation. Part 8. An open question. What if it's not an error? We have arrived at the most difficult moment of our lecture. Not because the material has become harder, but because we are entering an area where science falls silent and personal choice begins. Until now, we have spoken about what can be proven, about the neurobiology of memory, experimentally confirmed by thousands of studies, about social psychology, whose mechanisms have been studied and reproduced, about cognitive biases that can be measured and predicted. All of this is solid ground. Upon this rests the scientific understanding of the Mandela Effect. But science answers the question how, not the question why. It explains mechanisms, but does not touch upon meaning. And beyond the boundaries of the scientific method, there remains a space where each of us is free to choose what to believe. What remains outside explanations. Let's look at the facts once more. We have millions of people who share the same false memories. Psychologists explain this through conformity, cultural scripts, informational influence. All logical, all proven. But there is one, however. The Ash and Loftus experiments were conducted in laboratories, with small groups, under controlled conditions. The Mandela Effect is a spontaneous, global, uncontrolled phenomenon. It arose by itself, without experimenters' involvement. It encompasses millions of people, unacquainted with each other, living in different countries, speaking different languages. Can we say with certainty that laboratory mechanisms fully explain this phenomenon? Most scientists would say yes. But would they be 100% right? The problem of reductionism. The scientific approach always strives to reduce the complex to the simple. This is its strength. But it is also its limitation. When we reduce the Mandela Effect to memory errors, we lose something important. We lose the sense of mystery. We lose wonder. We lose the possibility that the world might be more complex than we think. Science does not say the world is simple. Science says we should explain it in the simplest possible way. But simplest does not mean only. It is merely a methodological principle, not ultimate truth. Unexplained coincidences. Notice one detail. The Mandela Effect is not random. It is structured. It clusters around certain themes: deaths of public figures, cultural artifacts, geographical representations. Why do people massively err precisely on these themes and not others? Psychologists would answer, because these themes are emotionally significant and culturally loaded. That is true. But it is a description, not an explanation. The question, why precisely these themes, remains open. One can answer, it just happened that way. Or one can wonder, what if there really is something special about these themes? The philosopher Immanuel Kant showed over 200 years ago that we never cognize the world in itself. We only cognize the world as it appears to us through the prism of our sense organs, our language, our categories of thought. Reality, in itself, the noumenon, is forever hidden from us. We deal only with phenomena, with how reality appears to us. In this sense, the question, does the past really change, or does it only seem so, is fundamentally incorrect. For us, what appears to us is real. If millions of people experience the memory of Mandela dying in prison, in a sense, that is their reality. What if different realities are possible? Modern physics, as we discussed in Part 5, allows for the existence of multiple realities. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is not science fiction, but a mathematically grounded hypothesis. We have no proof that it is true, but we also have no proof that it is false. If multiple realities exist, then the question of the correct past loses meaning. There is a past in this reality. There is a past in another. Different versions, may simply originate from different branches. This sounds like science fiction, but 100 years ago, the theory of relativity also sounded like science fiction. What if reality is being edited? The simulation hypothesis, which we discussed, also has no refutation. We cannot prove that we are not in a simulation. Any experiment, any observation, could be part of the simulation. If we are in a simulation, then the past is simply saved files that can be altered. The Mandela Effect represents moments when we notice a discrepancy between the current version of the files and our memory of the previous version. Where does the line lie? The line between scientific fact and personal belief lies where evidence ends. Science gives us evidence that memory is unreliable. Science gives us evidence that people are susceptible to social influence. Science gives us evidence that mass delusions arise and spread. Science does not give us evidence that the past really changes. But science also does not give us evidence that this is impossible. The choice remains yours. And here, on this boundary, each of us makes their choice. One can accept the scientific explanation and consider the Mandela Effect an interesting but fully explained phenomenon. This is rational, it is grounded, it rests on facts. One can leave room for doubt. One can allow that the world is more complex than we think. One can regard the Mandela Effect as a hint, a sign, an indicator of something we do not yet understand. Neither of these choices can be proven or disproven. It is a matter of your worldview, your experience, your intuition. What do you think? I will not impose an answer on you. I will only ask a question. When you hear about the Mandela Effect, when you encounter a memory that doesn't match the facts, when you see that millions of people remember what never happened, what do you feel? Curiosity? Anxiety? Wonder? Skepticism? And more importantly, what do you think? Perhaps you have your own theory. Perhaps you have encountered something similar in your own life. Perhaps you yourself carry a memory that doesn't fit into official history. Think about it. Not now, when you are listening and already drifting towards sleep. But later, in the morning, when you wake. Or in the coming days, when this conversation quietly echoes somewhere in the back of your mind. The question remains open. Final, return to yourself. Our lecture is coming to an end. We have traveled a long road. From concrete examples to neurobiology, from social psychology to quantum physics, from philosophy to critical analysis. We have examined the phenomenon from all sides. We have seen how much we know and how much remains beyond knowledge. And now, when the mind is saturated with information, when all arguments and counterarguments have been heard, it is time to let it all go. Let these thoughts not disturb you. Let them not make you doubt reality. Let them simply remain somewhere in the depths of your consciousness. An interesting fact, a curious story, a topic for reflection. Your memory is part of you. Even if it errs, these are your errors. They make you unique. They make you human. And now it is time to rest. Your body has long been ready. Your breathing has slowed. Your eyelids are heavy. Your mind is calming. Let all questions go. Let all doubts dissolve. Let all theories remain where they belong, in the world of ideas, not in your bedroom. Here and now, there is only you, your breath, your warmth, your safety.